Welcome to the Benson Wealth Podcast. I take complex financial and economic topics and make it accessible to the everyday listener. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Benson Wealth Podcast. My name is Drew Benson. I'm the president and founder of Benson Wealth Management and a senior wealth advisor with my broker-dealer, Raymond James. I'm also the co-managing partner for True North Wealth Management Group, which is a platform for independent wealth advisors. I'm a formerly trained macroeconomist and a certified financial planner. So today I interview Peter Earle. Pete works for the American Institute for Economic Research. He also holds a PhD in economics and is a former Wall Street trader. So today's another two-part interview. In the first part of this interview, Pete and I talk about the state of the economy, why GDP growth is slowing, inflation, and if a recession is on the horizon. We also talk about the extent to which government spending affects how the U.S. reports GDP data. Pete, welcome back to the podcast. Good to see you.
Great to be back. Thanks for having me.
So let's dig right into GDP growth. So you've been writing recently on the fact that GDP is starting to cool off. And so I wanted to get into the deeper reasons of why we're seeing a slowdown in the country's domestic productivity, I should say.
So the recent deceleration, I think, reflects four major areas in GDP, but there's a bigger reason. So the four that I would say are, we've got weakening consumption, right? Consumers are getting weakened by inflation and by higher interest rates and all that. We've got falling government spending, right? I have my own views about government spending. We'll talk about GDP later, but that's part of it. Americans have been buying a lot more foreign-made goods, right? And the U.S. has been selling fewer U.S.-made items overseas. That's a strong dollar effect. But basically, if I were to put it all together, basically, the recovery from the pandemic was like it was made up of a lot of fiscal spending and a lot of monetary stimulus. And that's like a shot of speed or another stimulant. It may increase, and it does increase, short-term performance. But the real gains aren't there. It's a short-term fix, but when it fades, there's nothing to fall back on. So that's what I think we're seeing right now. Is we're seeing, that sort of weakness creep in from, a quick response to the monetary and fiscal stimulus. That means that there's no real foundations there. It was really just sort of a quick fix.
Okay. Are you concerned about where GDP is heading moving forward? So do you think we might continue to slow down? What are your thoughts with the next few quarters?
Right. So I'm predicting a slowdown, if not a mild recession. And I'll tell you why I built in this caveat. Economists usually say one hand, then the other hand. But so the current administration is absolutely loaded for bear with fiscal stimulus measures, right? They've got the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. They've got the CHIPS and Science Act, and they've got the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. Now, those are designed to release funds into the economy at certain times, but I bet they could be moved around. So my concern is that by dumb luck, if we do see the slowdown, there's an expectation that the first quarter 1.6% GDP is going to be revised downward to 1.3 or 1.2% later this week. My concern is that the administration could release a lot of those fiscal funds, and they could blunt the effects of a slowdown. But I think that's the direction is down. Whether it's a mild recession or a slowdown or just whatever, I'm not sure. But that's definitely what I think is coming. I mean, I have some thoughts on monetary policy as well, but that's how I'll start off.
I mean, we'll go there for a second. I mean, what are your thoughts on the monetary policy piece?
So there's a wild card there too, and that is that recently, we've basically seen disinflation slow down and in some ways stop. Right? We had about the last CPI number was okay. It wasn't great, but I mean we've seen some pretty bad numbers in the last few months. And basically, about 2 weeks ago, Jerome Powell said that if we saw an unexpected weakening in labor markets, it could justify a more accommodative monetary policy stance, which means even if inflation is high, even if inflation, even if disinflation is slowed or stopped, they could still justify a rate cut. So I think he's building it out for a rate cut or two, regardless of what happens with inflation, and that's an alibi. And I don't think they want to disappoint financial markets. At the start of the year, the Fed had basically voiced the expectation of doing 3 rate cuts. The market, I watched market implied interest rates they saw 5 or 6 rate cuts, and so I mean it's just insane. And so I think the Fed feels sort of obligated to offer at least 1 or 2 in the coming months. So even if inflation doesn't get better, the Fed's going to try to do 1 or 2, and they built themselves out with this comment about unexpected weakening in U.S. labor markets.
Yeah, at the beginning of the year, I on this podcast said that I did not think there'd be any rate cuts in the first half of the year, and that was just because I remember actually listening to someone from the St. Louis Fed. It was about a year and a half ago, and he said all that money that got printed, he said a lot of that we're finding has not actually made it through the economy. It's sitting in people's bank accounts still. And I remember hearing him in the moment going, there's a long road left for inflation. If a good deal, I think he said about half of it hadn't even gotten into circulation, via velocity in the economy. If that's the case, then why are we so overly sanguine that all of a sudden inflation is just going to die off? And I still think that money's burning out. And what is your take on that?
So I agree with that, certainly. There's still a lot of money sloshing around. I noticed the other day that our monetary aggregates, M1 and M2, which had been negative for some time, it was the first time they've been negative for a long time. They're actually both positive for the first time in maybe 2.5 years. They're both positive now. So we have money supply growth again. The other thing is, there's a lot of things going into prices right now that the Fed's not going to be able to deal with. For example, about half of all U.S. states just put in place minimum wage laws. We're seeing tremendous gains in things like insurance. So those types of things, when they get set into prices, the Fed's not going to be able to affect them. So I think, the long-term direction of prices is probably up. We may see, them come down somewhat, but my ultimate concern is that in the next year or two, the Fed's going to be doing a review of its policies. I wouldn't be surprised if they did something like said, we're going to make the new inflation target 2.5% to 3%.
That's what I've wondered.
2.75%. Something like that. I wonder if the goalposts won't be moved, partially opportunistically and partially to sort of paper over the fact that it's been one failure after another for this Fed. I mean, when we look at it contextually, right? I mean, the last 4 years have been a carnival of errors for the Federal Reserve. They massively expanded the money supply, not only the size of the money supply, but the rate of increase of the money supply during COVID. Then we had inflation start in January 2021, and they waited months and months to do anything. Remember the whole transitory thing.
Yeah.
Then when they did begin to raise rates, they did so I think they did so in catch-up mode. They were panicking. Totally. And they raised it so much that they had, that we had a whole corner of the they were weak, but corner of the regional bank market, saw some failures and all that sort of thing. There was something like, at that time, $640 billion in unrealized losses on bond positions. And now, to me,
on the balance sheets,
yeah,
$640
billion in unrealized losses. That's why they opened up the bank term funding program. And then the fourth error, I think, is that now we're finding out that they didn't raise rates enough. I mean, I think anybody who's not thinking that anybody who thinks that there couldn't be one more rate hike or even 2 more rate hikes, later this year or the first half of next year, I don't think that they're looking at this properly. I mean, I have so many statistics to bring to bear if you want to talk about those. But I mean, like, there are many signs that inflation is it's not as bad as it was, say, a year and a half ago. But inflation is still very much a part of the U.S. economy, and it's killing consumers. It's raising costs for producers. It's still ravaging the economy.
One has to wonder, though, back to a point you were making a minute ago, but there's a political component to the Fed, right? And what I mean by that is there's expectations that have been set. Like you said, the markets had baked in. I remember looking at data on FactSet, and it shows like the predictions of where professional economists think rates are going. And you're right; it was like the market had already priced in 5 rate cuts. Did the Fed say, were they predicting 3? Was that the deal that they thought that they would engage in?
The Fed's dot plot. Yeah, the Fed's dot plot said 3 rate cuts this year.
Yeah, and here we are, and we're nowhere near the target that they want us to be at. 2% is a pretty far way to go. So, but I see the political side, though, to your point, they don't want to disrupt the financial markets, and so they're going to do something. Another possibility is, I wonder if they just don't touch rates, period, and let it stay higher for longer until it starts to peter out. But it seems like all options are potentially on the table if we're intellectually honest about this.
I agree. Another thing is that Another thing is that, of course, the Fed doesn't want to after making all these errors, the Fed doesn't want to basically admit it was wrong, and in so doing raise rates again. I don't think they want to raise rates because that would be showing that they've messed up for a fourth, maybe a fifth time.
Right.
But another element is because the Fed has all these mandates, right? Like I said earlier, Powell explicitly said unexpected weakness in labor markets could cause us to lower rates. And, there's large, New York State and California recently reported a huge gain in unadjusted unemployment claims. Basically Challenger, Gray, and Christmas said on May 2nd that hiring plans are at their lowest since 2016. So, the Fed won't have to define. They won't have to define, what unexpected means. They're only going to say, labor markets are cooling faster than we thought, so we're going to lower rates. They bought themselves an out, and they don't want to disappoint the market. So there's that too. But the other thing is that there's another force that's militating against higher interest rates, and that is the massive debt service that we have to pay on our debt.
Yeah. Huge.
If the Fed were to raise rates even, 25, 50 basis points, even if they thought it was absolutely necessary, absolutely justified. Yellen was just the other day saying that basically, the U.S., she said it in very sort of couched terms, but she basically said the U.S. needs to think about higher revenue because it looks like the longer-term direction of interest rates is up, which means more taxes. And she's saying that on top of a 2025 budget plan or a budget proposal that's something like $5 trillion in taxes. I mean, the amount of taxes up there the amount of taxes being shown in that proposal are incredible. I mean, it would be a withering barrage against anyone who owns a business. Things like taxes on unrealized gains, which I don't even know how that would work, right? Taxes on things like
I don't know either.
Raising the short-term capital gains tax. So some of that is just signaling, right? It's just the administration saying, "Hey, this is what we believe." But I mean, a lot of it are things that if even that doesn't meet our budget requirements or our growing deficits, I mean, it's a disaster for this country. And so the Fed is going to have an asymmetric bias to the downside in terms of rates for that reason as well.
Yeah, and there's going to be a ton of political pressure, right, from the Treasury and from Congress to eventually lower rates for that very point. In fact, I was looking at the data a couple months ago about the percent of federal government spending that is going towards just servicing the interest, the interest payments.
Right, debt service.
And it's the debt service is pretty extraordinary, and that is a bill that's getting becoming uglier and uglier for the federal government, most definitely. Let's get back to GDP, and I took us off path just a teeny bit, but I think this matters. Let's assume the Fed does cut rates a couple times towards the end of the year. What does that do to? Does that have a stimulating effect? Even though maybe you and I, Pete, feel like it's somewhat artificial and maybe bubble-ish in nature, could it have a stimulate? Like okay, so they lower rates by 0.5%, two quarter rate drops. How much does that actually help the United States economy, in your opinion?
Okay, so
that's
a great question, and that's a great question. I have a few answers to it. The first answer is psychologically it helps. People see it, all that sort of thing. I don't think that lowering rates a quarter, 50 basis points, whatever, 25, 50 basis points is going to have much effect on the actual economy. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why I think the Fed is having so much trouble fighting inflation. And that is the following. The tools that the Fed are now using were conceived of and last employed in earnest in an economy that was a manufacturing, industrial-based economy, right? We had the Rust Belt in the Midwest. We had all that stuff, and so you can sort of in your mind trace the causality between moving interest rates and what effect it will have on, say, a car maker or a ball bearing machine, factory in the Midwest. We now have a highly financialized, service-based economy. 40 years later, I'm not sure that these tools work as well, if they work at all, in this environment. Now, certainly to some extent, when you're tightening the money supply, when you take a contractionary perspective, a contractionary policy stance, from that perspective, you are going to sort of crimp businesses. But I think the lags and the variability is unknown right now. So it might be that, we used to say, oh, well, you raise interest rates a quarter point, you start to feel it in the economy 6 months, 18 months, something like that, between 6 and 18 months. We don't know what the answer is now. We don't know if the effect is, very sudden and then nothing, or if it takes 2 years. We don't know that. So unfortunately, a lot of what the Fed is doing, whether they know it or not, is experimenting. A lot of it is just figuring out if these tools work, how do they work, to what extent do they work. So for that reason, it's very hard to say what that rate cut will do. I think the market would love it. I think stocks would love it. I think, if you're somebody whose credit card rates are at 22%, annual percentage rate, I think you might go down to like 21%, which is still a withering, terrible number. But I mean, the actual effect, it's hard to say. And that's something I think that hasn't been spoken about enough, is that the tools that the Fed is using right now, the last time they were used, this was a very different American economy. When I try to explain to people sometimes, like, I used the example before of, imagine interest rates, the effect of interest rates on, say, a car maker in Detroit. All right, we can figure that out. This is more expensive, labor, all this stuff. Now imagine the effect of higher interest rates on a coffee shop, a dog walking service, something like that. It's a little harder to see how quickly or how impactful those rate increases will be. Now, some of it, of course, is going to happen, but we don't know the full scope of effects, how long they take, and how variable they are. So, yeah, we're in uncharted territory right now, and that's not a comforting thought. I think that's one of the reasons why the Fed has been talking about lowering rates, and some people out there like Kashkari and me and possibly you have been saying, I could see another rate hike or two. Yeah. I could see the Fed saying, hey, we're getting our feet underneath us.
Yeah, no, I mean, for a while I really did feel like the Fed was going to lower rates towards the second half of the year. I just didn't think it would happen in the first half, and now I'm getting to the point where I really wouldn't be surprised to see 0 rate cuts in 2024, period. I
think that's a very safe and a very realistic possibility. They might not raise, but they might not lower either. Right.
Correct. And I think the not raising has more to do with political pressures and servicing the national debt. I think that's probably the story behind it. Now another thing that's
definitely the case. Yeah.
Yeah. There's just a lot of intangibles that aren't going to be as rational as maybe two financial guys would do it, but there's obviously other incentives that drive policymakers, and it's not just how does this affect the financial markets and to the American consumer. There's, staying on as the Fed governor. There's staying on as the next president or the next congressman. So I think we forget that
there's maintaining public faith in the institution itself.
That's right. Absolutely, 100%. And they can't show that they completely blew it if they feel internally that maybe that they have. The other thing I've been thinking about is the lag effect of rate hikes. So we talk about rate hikes as if it just happens, immediately. But I was talking to it was one of the big investment firms, I forget if it was JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs, and they were saying there isn't a debt wall on corporate debt, right? So remember, a lot of these companies refinanced their debt at ultra low levels in 2020 or before, and they're locked in for 10 to 15 years in some of these deals. So just because the Fed is raising the discount window doesn't necessarily mean that a lot of corporations are going to see higher servicing costs because they may not have to redo any of their debt until 2031. And what I had heard, and I don't know where it came from, but what I had heard from a friend of mine was they don't think there's really a debt wall until about 2031, which I thought was interesting. So we have to remember there's a lag effect to these policies, correct?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so that's another reason why it might be safe for the Fed to leave things instead of raising or lowering it, 5.25%. Because if you're doing an experiment, you probably don't want to change many variables. So they may be looking to see right now. I'm sure they're actually looking right now to see exactly what the lags are of these policies in, again, a highly financialized, service-based economy. I think they're going to try to get data, and we're going to see a lot of papers about that. About the corporate debt, though, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the same reason with for firms that are selling, whether it's corporate debt or whether they're selling high yield debt or whatever, those are going to be locked in for a while. And one of the markets that I follow really closely is the commercial paper markets, like the 90-day commercial paper.
Okay.
Because that's a lot of times where you see what the effective rates that firms are going to be paying are paying.
Because it's so immediate.
Right.
It's so immediate. So let's talk about GDP again. You you have expressed that you feel like we could be moving towards a recession.
Yeah.
Are we heading towards a recession? And I mean, by the way, you get a lot of slack on this podcast because predicting the future is very, very difficult. So I'm not going to hold you to it, Pete. I'm not going to hold you to it. There's a lot of grace here. What's your general sense on where's the economy going right now? Do you see a recession on the horizon? And if so, what's a general time frame when you think that could occur?
A couple of things. We've seen some kind of lousy employment numbers recently. If the U3 employment rate rises to 4.0% the next 2 months or so, it'll trigger the SOM rule. You're probably familiar with it. If the viewers aren't, the SOM rule is basically an indicator. It's had almost 100% success, and it basically says that a recession begins when the 3-month average national unemployment rate rises by at least half a percentage point. Half a percentage point off its low over the previous 12 months. We're very close to that right now. And if it happens in the next 2 months, if we see a U3 number of 4.0 or so, the SOM will be triggered. The 6-month average of net unemployment flows, that's net jobs minus net jobs lost, has been negative for 12 months.
Really?
Those are a couple of things. Another thing I've been looking at really closely, and I've been wrong on that. Well, not necessarily wrong, but I've been surprised for some time is consumers have stuck it out for longer than I thought. I really thought that consumers were through their pandemic savings in August or September of 2023. But the fact is that most recently, consumer expectations hit their lowest level since July 2022. Families are concerned about their financial situations. There's a lot of financial distress out there. I heard a report the other day that car repos are at a record high, which is incredible. A lot of distress out there, a lot of credit cards in arrears, that sort of thing. Now, What's been clever is that, markets respond to all sorts of incentives and all sorts of, needs. And we've seen the growth of some really sort of amazing ways to keep people spending. These so-called buy now, pay later plans, which are technically not credit. It's basically like an installment plan, like one would have seen in the 1920s or maybe the 1960s. Those have kept spending going for quite some time. But nevertheless, declining health of the labor market, elevated prices, higher interest rates, distress in household finances, all that stuff is lowering optimism among consumers. It's also starting to impact the optimism of small business people. And small businesses are the cauldron of economic growth in America. When they start to go, then we have real trouble. And that's what I'm starting to see now. Now, I do have to add this. Every time I say something like this, and every time we get bad numbers, we get them for 3 months in a row, and then we get a surprisingly good number. And that's the effect of these sort of like these post-pandemic sort of distortions of the markets, the use of monetary the policy and all these things that we've had happening in the economy that we haven't seen in a long time. So there's a lot of head fakes in the numbers. But I think, by and large, the economy is weakening right now. Maybe there could be, some very mild monetary stimulus with the lowering of rates. I don't know how long, we just mentioned this, we don't know how long that takes to manifest.
Correct.
Again, fiscal stimulus, it's out there. How much it will help, I don't know. But I think, even if we don't have a recession, I think we're in for some weakness this year and possibly a recession as well. Absolutely.
Okay. And would you say that's towards the end of the year, or do you see that maybe as early as like Q3?
No, I think by the end of the year we would see it.
Okay.
The thing that's funny, Drew, is that if I told you to imagine a U.S. economy that is where GDP is 0.01 quarter after quarter, you would say that sounds terrible. That's lousy. Guess what? That's not a recession by definition. It
Correct.
would feel terrible. It would look like a recession, but it wouldn't be a recession. So that's why I'm saying I don't know if we're necessarily going to have 2 down quarters. I mean, we had it the first 2 quarters of 2022, and we're not allowed to call it a recession for some reason. But I mean,
right.
I could easily, I was the nomenclature police brought me in and read me the riot act for saying that was a recession. Which, by the way, I still say it's a recession. But I mean, if you imagine an economy that's growing 0.2, then 0.4, then 0.3, then 1.0, then 0.1. I mean, that's terrible. That may not be a recession, but it sure would feel like one.
Yeah, and coming out of the pandemic, you'd think we'd see 4 or 5%, GDP growth rates the way we have, and prior recoveries, but it seems like since 2008, our rate of recovery has been tepid is probably the nicest word I could even give it. That's been the nature of the United States economy. There's usually a slingshot effect after recessions, and we're not getting those slingshot effects anymore. And that's probably a byproduct of a growing state. I think it's a lot of private sector activities being crowded out by public sector spending is really, I think, at the heart of it.
I think you're right, and I think that the regulatory edifice has become massive.
Yeah, huge.
I mean, I think it used to be that you could look at the Federal Register for the number of pages, but so much of it now has to do with even things that to a certain extent many businesses these days they're super cautious about capital investment. They're super cautious about growth because we've had these sort of more and more sort of radical anti-free market or hampered market economy presidencies, administrations. So I think that there's sort of a natural sort of blunting of business growth that takes place, and that's one of the reasons why we're getting these slow recoveries. Why
I agree.
For secular reasons, growth is slowing down. So it's very unfortunate, and it falls into this whole category of like these Bastiat type things, the unseen, right? We can say that we can say that X number of jobs were lost during the pandemic, or that X amount of capital investment never took place, capex, whatever. But what we'll never be able to say is we should have had this kind of recovery, but we only got this kind. And that's one of the challenges of economics, is trying to express that, the trade-offs that are involved. And also, just because you can't see it doesn't mean you aren't taking a beating.
Well, and we're a society that likes to measure things, and so unless you have some sort of statistic to back it up with, then it's therefore not valid. But you can't measure the truly unseen, because that's what it is. It's to a degree it's intangible, but we could at least posit a world in which, what if we didn't have some of these onerous, burdensome government regulations? I think you could easily see a world where you see much healthier growth rates. You just can't put that into a neat econometric model and present it to the public and the president, et cetera, and make your case. Right. And even if you could, I don't even think anyone would listen to it, because it's not really driven on that either.
That's another thing, and it's important to mention it. Although it's not a direction I think you or I want to talk about, but I mean, like, the level of tribalism in considering facts about the economy has gone so tremendous that I mean, people will find reasons not to believe certain things. I mean, a few weeks ago, the president said that when he took office, inflation was at 9%. I mean, I don't know who in the world would believe that, but I do know that there are people who defended that assertion. It's like, wait, you can't even say that. I mean, even people in his own administration were trying to correct him on that, because it's just so glaring. And I think I mean, first of all, we know that the economy matters, but I think how bad things are when the government is not only telling you that facts aren't true, they're saying, don't believe your eyes. Yeah. Don't believe your wallet. Believe me. I mean, that's how sort of heated and this season and this sort of public receptiveness to facts has become. I mean, there's this complete abdication of common sense, a complete abdication of sort of acknowledging that some facts are just facts, and then they can't really be disputed.
Yeah, it's discouraging. Well, I mean, I think inflation peaked in June of 2022 is my recollection. That's right. So it's literally 2.5 years later. 2.5 years. Yeah. It's 30 months. And so, but unfortunately, to your point, I think people have got their guy, and whatever their guy says is correct, and whether it's got an R next to it, a D next to it, or an L next to it, or an I for independent, it's like, well, they have to always be right because it's my people, and we don't take policies sort of one at a time and try to assess what's correct and what's not correct. Right. We are very politically tribalistic, that's for sure.
When the president said, inflation was 9% when he came into office, I wrote an article where I chose all the other. I wrote an article a few weeks ago where I said, maybe he was thinking about this 9. So I mentioned that a sirloin steak was like $9.40 when he took office, and now it's 27% higher. Maybe that's what he was talking about.
That's funny. Good stuff. Right. All right, let's talk about GDP. So we know what GDP is. Right. What is the difference between measuring GDP. So what is GDP, and then how is it different, and why does that matter? Sure. Is the last thing.
So we're not the first people at AIR to come up with this, but GDP is gross domestic private product. And in it, what it means is we cut the government spending portion out of the calculation of domestic output, right? So we keep investment, we keep consumption, we keep trade, but we cut out government spending. And so first of all, G doesn't include transfer payments, so Social Security and all that stuff is still in there. So it's not perfect, but basically what we found is that the average growth rates before and after 2000 slumped down. So what we're finding is that that G portion, the government spending portion, has become a bigger portion and a bigger influence on growth. And I think, so I mean, you mentioned crowding out before. I think there's a lot of that. We also, related to this, we also wrote an article, I and my colleague Tom Savage here at AIR, we also wrote an article showing that basically states have become more and more dependent upon government spending as well. Mm-hmm. And that government spending comes with a few things. First of all, it comes with, less independence for citizens because their leaders become beholden to the federal government. It also means that, when governments finance spending by taking on debt, there's two effects. The first is that, that any private investors who purchase government debt do that at the cost of whatever else they might have been investing in, right? So instead of investing in, a certain new project or whatever, they're gonna basically invest in debt. And then additionally, the spending on that debt is basically, James Buchanan said it's chopping up apple trees for firewood, right? So the yield of the orchard is forever altered, right? And also, something that we all know is that debt finance spending shifts tax burdens from current to future generations. So
that's right.
Bond investors, they trust that their loan's going to be paid back with interest. It's the future generations that are going to pay that cost. And so, I can't help but think that, my great-grandchildren will probably say, man, great-granddad, what the hell were you thinking at that time? Why did you let them do that?
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah.
Well, you're fighting the good fight, but there's a lot of people that are, unfortunately, they believe that government spending is part of it. And frankly, even in the major even with a lot of major thinkers in the economics world, they believe in this sort of Keynesian model that the G in the multiplier is one of the ways that you sort of spark the economy back into place because of animal spirits and hoarding and whatnot. And it's really an absurd assertion.
What's funny about that is that, let's say, so first of all, as I recall, the Keynesian prescription spoke about debt, not about money, not about monetary stimulus. So that was about floating debt when the economy, when GDP is falling, when demand, aggregate demand is falling. The government would issue bonds. They'd have these big work projects. And then when the economy came up or was rising again and growth returned, the government would buy back those bonds. Somehow we never seem to get that part of it. It always seems to be we're going to issue lots of debt, but somehow that debt doesn't get bought back. So our political betters, and I say that with a lot of sarcasm, they seem to have forgotten about the other side, which involves buying that debt back and basically making space for business to come in again. That's very, very different than the way it's manifested. I still don't think, and there's a lot of reasons why the Keynesian prescription is wrong, but this has not been a faithful rendition of it by any means.
Interesting. I don't think I fully appreciated that. I always sort of assumed that Keynes was more of in the camp that we're just going to continue to add debt and that it was going to work. I didn't realize there was a buyback part to the debt as well. So I think I've even had a misunderstanding of Keynes.
The idea was like this sort of like a harmonica, right? Like government steps in, business pulls back, government steps in, business comes back in, government pulls out, that sort of thing. Now, there are also post-Keynesians and neo-Keynesians, and they might have prescriptions which sort of embody more like what we see today. But my understanding and my recollection is that even in its earliest manifestations, it wasn't exactly the way it was theorized. And I'm not saying Keynes was, some great thinker or whatever. He was definitely incredibly
You're just trying to be honest, though. You're trying to be honest about what his actual theory was.
About, right.
Yeah, no, I think that's intellectually good and fair. It seems like most Keynesians today, maybe I shouldn't say most, many seem to have taken what Keynes meant for fiscal policy. They've taken those ideas and they've applied it more to monetary policy. Is that true?
Oh yeah, I mean the MMTers are nothing if not like monetary Keynesians, and not only they're monetary Keynesians, they're like chartalists. They're people who believe that money only has value because it's collected as taxes. And I don't even want to go into the MMTers, but technically
We'll do
speaking,
that another time.
MMT, modern monetary theory, is a a sort of a sixth or eighth or 10th degree later Keynesianism.
Interesting. So
Yeah.
let's talk a little bit more about GDPP, and then we'll switch gears about our next subject.
Sure.
You talk about the broken window fallacy in one of your articles. Explain what the broken window fallacy is. I think it's a great one from Bastia. Explain what that is, and how is that the case with government spending in many instances?
Right. So Bastiat spoke about the broken window fallacy in the following way. You're in a small town. There's I don't remember if it was an accident or if it's a kid playing, whatever. But imagine that a rock goes sailing through a window, breaks the window, and people say, well, there's this idea. Well, that's actually a good thing because, you take the broken window to the glazier, to the glass guy. You pay him money. He puts new glass in. You need some window. Maybe you need some wood for the frame. So the lumber gets cut down. That wood gets sold to a lumber yard. Then it gets sold to a craftsman who makes the frame. So everybody benefits, right? So all this effort goes into fixing a window, and it really creates growth. All that stuff. And of course, if that were true, I mean, we should just constantly wage war, right? Or we should just build battleships and then sink them. Because, right? Yep. So what Bastiat's point is the fallacy there is that what's unseen is all of the things that time and that money and those resources could have been used for otherwise, instead of fixing a broken window, right? So, perhaps the timber that was used that eventually was sold to a lumberyard that went to fix the window, went to fix the whatever it's called, the frame, right? That could have been part of building a new home. The glazier could have been crafting glass that would have been sold profitably, for consumers or whatever else. So that manifests when we talk about GDP, because there's this idea that when the government steps in and creates work and all these sorts of things, that it necessarily adds value. And what we never see is, for example, we never see what the tax money that was taken to pay for these things would have done otherwise. I mean, certainly many people would have used it to consume goods and services. Some of them might have started businesses. Some of those businesses might have been very successful and hired more people. The other thing is, as I mentioned, it also has to do with the debt. Anybody who buys debt is using money away from a more productive use. Now, of course, buying debt, usually we talk about it in the context of, corporate debt or, whatever else, municipal bonds, commercial paper, whatever. But government debt, right, is basically the government, borrowing to invest in certain things, to either, plow into certain businesses or to do things that are theoretically outside the scope of the market, like the court system and the military. But the fact is that all of these things represent an alternative use of money that might have been used by consumers, by investors, by entrepreneurs, by business managers in ways that would have a much more direct tie to economic growth than you find with these sorts of things where the government, uses money to create, to invest in businesses or create jobs. And I want to quickly add, government never creates jobs. Government can take money and put it somewhere and hire people to do things, but the only way jobs are created is through the private market. Those are not, that's jobs created by redistribution are not really commercially viable jobs. Now, I know people get paid and government employees, they use that money for consumption. I get that. But I mean, in terms of, true economics, it's a job is basically an economic capacity that's created by a successful business, to be filled by somebody to make the business more productive, to expand the business's, footprint or whatever. And so, most people don't consider government, or I should say most people who believe in free markets don't really consider government jobs as, truly legitimate jobs that are created because of, improving economic circumstances. Instead, they're created because of redistribution of basically taxpayer wealth. It's either redistribution, right, through taxes, it's either selling bonds, which is taking on debt, or it's monetary expansionism, or it's more money being created, none of which are economically productive.
Yeah. So let's then talk about GDP versus GDPP. So now that we've kind of laid out the argument that when you break a window, it's not increasing wealth. A window is a form of wealth. It keeps heat in or cold air in. It allows you to see and look out at a beautiful landscape potentially. So there's value in these goods and services. There's value, tangible value to them, which is part of what creates wealth. So when you destroy wealth, you're destroying wealth. It's not creating wealth by creating more jobs. Now that we understand that argument, what does GDPP look like compared to GDP, and how much of the GDP data, or how much of the number that's going into GDP is coming from the government portion?
Right. So basically, the average percentage of G is something like 25% from 1950 to 1923. It's about 28%, 1950 to 1999, and basically, the basic idea is that there's a slump in the average growth rate. The average annual growth rate of GDP prior to 2000 was 3.63%. After 2000, as we started to get a lot of these big programs, we have, the post 9/11 war. We have, of course, the 2008 spending. We have COVID. We have we go from 3.63% to 2.34%, which is, about 1% and a third less in terms of GDP. And that one and a third, roughly 1.5% is huge. We're talking about, probably hundreds of billions of dollars less. It's a monstrous thing, and it's being occupied by more of a government footprint in the economy. I mean, that's the most fundamental thing that we can hope that people appreciate when they hear this, is not just that taxes should be lower, not just that the government interventionism affects the market and it sort of supplants private actors, but that there has been an utter change in the role of the relationship, a change in the relationship between human beings and the state over the last, say, 100 years, but in particular, even the last 20. I would argue in the last 5. And you're never going to see the absence of that extra, 1.3% growth, but it's out there, and it should make people think about whenever somebody thinks, my potholes used to be filled quicker. Now, we're full of potholes. Where did that money go? Where is that money? Well, I mean, some of it is in Syria, in U.S. military bases. Some of it is being spent on pet projects. Some of it's being redistributed as foreign aid. But I mean, these are all things that nobody ever thinks about. But the fact is that, more of a government impact, more of a government role in the economy takes away from the most productive part of our economy, and that is basically private growth, private enterprise.
If you've enjoyed this content and you're looking for a wealth advisor, or if you're a financial advisor and you're looking to make the jump to the independent side, please message me on LinkedIn, or you can email me at drew.benson@bensonwealthmgt.com, or lastly, you can call my office at 603-316-2544. Securities offered through Raymond James Financial Services, Inc., member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services are offered through Raymond James Financial Services Advisors, Inc. Benson Wealth Management and True North Wealth Management Group are not registered broker-dealers, and they are independent of Raymond James Financial Services. The foregoing information has been obtained from sources considered to be reliable, but we do not guarantee that it is accurate or complete. It is not a statement of all available data necessary for making an investment decision, and it does not constitute a recommendation. Any opinions are those of myself and not necessarily those of Raymond James. Expressions of opinion are as of this date and are subject to change without notice. There is no guarantee that these statements, opinions, or forecasts provided herein will prove to be correct. Investing involves